an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Parable of the Talents, chapters 3, 4, and 5. In these chapters, we get to see a little bit more of the growth of Acorn, and we find out more about what happened with that house truck, which turns out to be quite a boon that they found. This is a tough section for me. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Many thanks to Danique for commissioning this episode. So I don't know how many of you recall how things went down with the first two chapters, but this book is being told to us from the perspective of Lauren's daughter, who is reading through her mother and father's old journal entries and giving us, the readers, her thoughts on how she interprets the way that they see Earthseed as a movement and as a belief system, as well as how she interprets their actions as people from what she saw growing up. And it's a really interesting tact to take, because I feel like it's easy to have somebody like Lauren seem almost godlike herself, or like a saint of some kind, which her daughter already seems to think is happening. And that's, she thinks that's happening in terms of everybody who is in the book who knew her mother. And it is something that could easily happen as well for the readers. And I feel like this is a really good way for the author to sidestep the danger of that by having it be these people who have taken on an almost savior-like quality being viewed as regular flawed parents. Her daughter's name is Larkin, but I don't feel like we've actually, because I had to look that up because I felt like I had missed it. I don't feel like we've actually heard her name mentioned anywhere in the books so far. But I don't like to just continue calling her Lauren's daughter. So I went and found, and that's one of the names she's listed as. Apparently there's more than one, which I wouldn't be surprised if she moved somewhere else and found that she had to change her name. But I just wanted to give you guys a heads up that I looked it up because I felt like it was making for weird conversation. It's sort of like when I covered Rebecca. Those of you who have read that book know that the main character, it turns out, does not actually have a name. And it's a really difficult thing to cover for a book club because of that. So I wound up having to just assign her a name in order to be able to discuss things a little bit more easily. So chapter 3 begins with an excerpt from something that's labeled From Memories of Other Worlds, which we find out later that Lauren actually published a lot of her thoughts regarding Earthseed. And she thought at first, because of the way that she was encouraged to do this, that it was about having a copyright on this thought and this information. But it turns out that what he really thought was, this is going to be taken a lot more seriously by everybody if it looks like it's been actually published. If it's been published, they're going to trust that this is true or more likely to be true. And I think that's reasonable. I absolutely, as a child, did not understand that things are not I always thought that if you went to publish something, you would have fact checkers along with your editor, double checking everything that you claimed and making sure that it was all true before it was printed. Because I thought that there was some sort of regulation about printing things that were not true. I was a child. Bless my heart. I didn't think that, not only did I think that book companies would not want to publish lies because it would make them look bad, but I thought that it would be understood how much of a danger it would be to just be able to publish literally whatever you want. So while I understood that there were self-published things, I figured, did not come with the same oversight, and people published things in that manner because they were false. And these people knew that the powers that be that approve publishing would not allow these folks to publish their lies, and so they were forced to go a different route. Isn't that sweet? I just really believed that. And it appears in this sort of climate that is sort of what people still believe. I think that people really do still believe that in general. Like, if something is in a book, they just feel it's more likely to be true. And it's just upsetting to realize how little oversight there is over anything. And to a degree, I understand that we don't want to have a censored society, but also the fact that we can just basically say whatever, put it to print, and deal with the consequences of it later if it turns out to not be true is very troubling. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So this excerpt that we start off with is actually not from Lauren's point of view, but from her husband's. He says, "I cannot know what the end will be of all of Olamina's dreaming, striving, and certainty. I cannot recall ever feeling as certain of anything as she seems to be of Earthseed, a belief system that she herself created, or, as she says, a network of truths that she has simply recognized. I was always a doubter when it came to religion. How irrational of me, then, to love a zealot. But then, both love and zealotry are irrational states of mind. Olamina believes in a God that does not in the least love her. In fact, her God is a process or combination of processes, not an entity. It is not consciously aware of her or of anything. It is not conscious at all. God is change, she says, and means it. Some of the faces of her God are biological evolution, chaos theory, relativity theory, the uncertainty principle, and of course, the second law of thermodynamics. God is change, and in the end, God prevails. Yet, Earthseed is not a fatalistic belief system. God can be directed, focused, speeded, slowed, shaped. All things change, but all things need not change in all ways. God is inexorable, yet malleable. Odd. Hardly religious at all. Even the Earthseed destiny seems to have little to do with religion. So I really enjoyed this summary of the idea behind Earthseed. And it seems like Larkin also enjoyed it. She says that my father defined Earthseed in fewer words than I could have managed. When my mother was a child, protected and imprisoned by the walls of her neighborhood, she dreamed of the stars. Literally, at night, she dreamed of them. And she dreamed of flying. I've seen her flying dreams mentioned in her earliest writings. Awake or asleep, she dreamed of these things. As far as I'm concerned, that's what she was doing when she created her Earthseed destiny and her Earthseed verses. Dreaming. We all need dreams, our fantasies, to sustain us through hard times. And when she talks about the fact that Earthseed doesn't have an afterlife the way that a lot of other religions do, she says it promises its people immortality only through their children, their work, and their memories. For the human species, immortality is something to be won by sowing earth seed on other worlds. It promises not mansions, milk and honey, eternal oblivion. Its promise is of hard work and brand new possibilities, problems, challenges, and changes. Apparently, that can be surprisingly seductive to some people. My mother was a surprisingly seductive person. So, again, this is just such a weird moment because it feels like Larkin is accusing her mother of something here. Like the way that she says, my mother was a very seductive person. There's a real tone to that that suggests she does not believe either that... I think she knows from the journal entries that her mother believed what she said. But I believe in the first chapters, she does say something about how she gets the vibe almost that her mother wrote these journals knowing that somebody was going to read them someday. And so she purposefully kind of covered her ass, even in her journal entries, and created this like record of that's really very curated and, you know, what's the word I want when somebody is, it's like she's working on her brand, to be honest. So there is something to be said for these journals supporting everything that she claimed, but her daughter feels like the journals are just part of a larger sort of falseness, that doesn't stem from her mother, like, not believing in Earthseed, but more that her mother's ego was an obstacle that Larkin doesn't seem convinced her mother was able to overcome. And it sounds like that's kind of valid. It's a hard thing to know because naturally we are all a little bit more suspicious of our parents than anybody else is a lot of the time when we get older. Obviously, when we're younger, unless we are in a kind of shitty situation, we tend to believe our parents above everybody else. But this is a really, you know, this is a woman who is removed enough from her time, and we don't get a real sense of how... I feel like Larkin doesn't mention how old she is, but I get the impression she's in like her early 20s at this point. But yeah, I would just be really interested to see what exactly it is that caught, because like when you are young, like I said, you tend to believe your parents. What was the thing that first made her go, maybe my mom is a little bit full of shit? Not completely. I'm not saying she's just lying to everybody, but she has such a carefully constructed persona, and maybe this persona means more to her than the truth, perhaps. I'm interested to get to that point and see exactly what it is that Larkin sort of, what set her off. Because I feel like we all have moments in our lives that you can sort of see it happened, that you can point to it and be like, this was one of the first times I ever realized that my parent could be really wrong about something. And, you know, you may not remember off the top of your head, but I think that's something that we all do have. And, you know, it's sort of a weird, it's like something that has to happen in order for you to grow as a person. You have to realize that everybody whom you admire or respect or look up to, everybody is in the end just a person. And so they're not infallible, and they're not necessarily going to be able to know everything or always choose correctly and make no mistakes. You have to grow beyond that to grow as a person. But in doing that, you also have this like incredible loss that is genuinely like heartbreaking at the time, even though you don't even quite understand what's happening while you're experiencing it. And that, depending on how many times that happens to you, because if we're lucky, it happens twice, once with each of our parents. if we are not lucky, it happens many times as many different authority figures and people that we trusted turn out to be not trustworthy for one reason or another. Unfortunately, a lot of people experience it multiple times, from grandparents, aunts and uncles, teachers, coaches, all of these people that pass through our lives and take up a lot of space while they're in there. Some of us experience a lot more damage at the hands of these people than others. And in this particular world that we're living in here, in this scene, in this book, more than this scene, I feel like that has to happen even more than, you basically in this universe cannot trust almost anybody. And we'll see what happens with that with this kid Dan later. But I just feel very curious about Larkin in general, because there's such acid in the way that she says certain things. And then there's such room in the way that she says other things, as if she's really trying to give space to certain ideas and not trample them. And I don't have as great a grasp on why she chooses what she does as I want to yet. So we're going to go to a journal entry. Monday, October 4th, 2032. Krista Neuer died today. That was her name. Krista Koslau Neuer. She never regained consciousness. So this woman is the mother of the kids that were discovered with this house truck. She was beaten, raped, shot, and left for dead. And maybe if they had been able to get to her sooner than they did, she would have made it out, but I suspect not. She was alive when they found her, but she's not able to hold on. And I love the fact that Bankole, when he's like instructing everybody on how to care for this woman, specifically is like, okay guys, I want all women to be looking after her, because when she wakes up, if she is surrounded by strange men, that might send her into a panic. I love the fact that he thinks of this and that he appreciates this, because guys, this is the kind of moment where some guys would hashtag not all men and would not care how this poor woman felt or how she would react. And they would have no sympathy except to feel their own ego being tarnished by association with the gender that harmed her. And they would just be really defensive about that. I recently ran into this, and it is so hard to get guys to understand. Like, men see themselves as distinct, like, entities with different personalities, and that they can separate themselves from the harm done by other men. And that would be great, except that we don't know which one you are. As women, we do not know when we see you on the street if you are one of those that can harm us or would want to harm us, or one of those that is not interested in that at all. And it's similar to being bit by a dog. When you run into a strange dog on the street that isn't leashed, you're going to react with extreme caution, because maybe you've been bit before and you don't know what kind of animal this one's going to turn out to be. And nobody would ever blame you for having that kind of caution, especially if you had been bitten before and you still have a sort of phobia. But so many men cannot set aside their motherfucking egos in service of understanding women's perspective in this regard. And it is deeply frustrating, because it's, in truth, is all about their egos. They want to feel like they are one of the good ones and that we know that and recognize that. It's so not about you that I can't even say it enough times. So this little moment of Bankole separating himself completely from what she went through and simply understanding she went through some shit The people who did it to her were men. Let's keep men away from her. It is so fucking 1 + 1 is 2. Very simple. That it just makes me delighted that this is taken as like a matter of course and not something that everybody decides to argue over. The boy's name is Danton Neuer Jr. He wants to be called Dan. We burned the body of Danton Neuer Sr. as soon as we got it back to Acorn. Now we'll have to burn his wife. We'll hold services for both of them when Dan is well enough to attend. So Dan is coming along. He's able to make it through in a lot of ways because of these maggots that Bankole used, which I don't want to get into that because that makes me sick, but I know that they have their uses. His sisters made it, Cassia and Mercy. And he is so, because the attack that came upon them, Dan pretended to be dead. He played dead for a little while. And assumed that everybody had been killed. He had 2 older sisters as well, and they actually get taken by the attackers, these guys, this gang of dudes. And he had to play dead and lay there while his sisters were screaming because they were being raped. And I cannot tell you how horrifying. That's the kind of thing that you'll never forget for the rest of your life. And he is clearly in a bad way. In some ways, what Lauren experienced was a mercy because she didn't actually witness the deaths of the people that she cared about. She found out secondhand that they were all dead. And so in some ways, that's a bummer because you're always holding on to that hope that maybe they saw the wrong person, or maybe they, maybe somebody got away and they just didn't realize that they actually survived. But so in that way, the uncertainty would bother me. And of course, also just not being able to say goodbye would bother me, but not having to watch it happen, I feel like is a bit of a mercy, because then she's not going to have that mental video playing over and over in her mind for the rest of her life of seeing people that she loved being hurt and killed. And I will admit that a part of me has been suspecting that her father is still alive out there somewhere because he never came home. And as much as I want to assume that he's dead, because that's kind of a more brutally realistic outcome, there is a part of me that wonders if he isn't still alive somewhere and isn't going to pop up later. I part of me hopes so because I want her to get some kind of break in that department, and another part of me hopes not, because I like the realism of this just being left sort of up in the air and uncomfortable, to be honest. Some things you don't get closure on, and that's just life. It's really, really tough, but there it is. So one of the women that's living here and helping them all is named May, and May had her tongue cut out. And it says, "We don't know who did it. I've heard that in some of the more religious towns, repression of women has become more and more extreme. A woman who expresses her opinion, nags, disobeys her husband, or otherwise, quote, tramples her womanhood, unquote, and, quote, acts like a man, unquote, might have her head shaved, her forehead branded, her tongue cut out, or worst case, she might be stoned to death or burned. I've only heard about these things. May is the first example of it that I've ever seen, if she is an example. I'm glad to say her terrible wound had healed by the time she came to us. We don't even know whether May is her real name, but she can say May, and she's let us know we're to call her that. It's always been clear that she loves kids and gets along well with them. Now, with the little Neuer girls, it seems that she has a family. She's been sharing a cabin with Allie Gilchrist and Allie's adopted son Justin for the better part of a year. Now I suppose we'll have to either expand Allie's cabin or begin work on a new one. In fact, we need to begin work on 2 or 3 new ones. The Scolari family will be getting the next one. They've been cooped up with the Figueroas long enough. Then the Dovetrees, then the Noyers, and May. So we get a really good look here at the fact, like, at how much this little community is growing, and that they are able to build individual residences for a lot of these people. Like, they pair up when they have to, and when people are new and they don't know how long they're going to stay, or if they're going to, want to be a part of this permanently. But then once it becomes clear that they're not going anywhere, there's an effort by the community to build little homes for each of them. And it makes me really want, because of the way this book is structured, it's a weird combination of like epistolary because of the journal entries, but also narrative because of the daughter's like contributions and commentary, that I can't quite get a handle on something. Like, I want the daughter to step back from everything here and there and to describe exactly what this compound looks like now, with like from where she is and who is there now. And I want a bigger overview, because when we start this, we just jump right into my mother is dead. She was kind of full of it. And here are some of her journal entries. And we don't get a ton of context about where she is coming from or what is going on with her. And on that same note, because we don't get that, and because these are journal entries that are meant to be read by people who sort of already have an idea about what's going on, there's not detailed descriptions of the layout of things. And so I don't have a good sense in my head about where everything is located and how much room they have. And, I'm not asking for somebody to draw a map at the beginning of the book or anything, but it would seem a little bit unnatural, I feel like, if things were described that way in a journal entry. But I'm just used to having that kind of information sort of fed to me, and it's not necessarily even relevant. It's just my curiosity. So she says that, she being Lauren, says that when she's around Dan, it can be a little tough because he still experiences pain pretty frequently. And with her being hyper empathic, she feels it every time. And May is also a sharer. And there's another family that has its mother and father are sharers, as are all three of their kids. And they are pretty vulnerable because of that. She says that at this point, we're 67 now with the Neuer children. We're growing too fast. And yet, in another way, we're only creeping along. We're not only Acorn, we're Earthseed. And we're still only a single tiny hill community squeezed into too few cabins and sharing an almost 19th century existence. The truck will improve our comfort, but it's not enough. I mean, it may be enough for Acorn, but it's not enough for Earthseed. So I feel like that's the first time that she acknowledges what Acorn is only a stepping stone and not the main event for her, which I don't know how free she is with saying things like that around everybody else, but it's a loaded thing to say, I feel like, because it can make the people you're with either feel like they're going to be part of something bigger, or that they're not that significant in the face of what you would rather be doing. And that's a tough line to walk. And I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out she just doesn't, she decides not to mention anything like this to anyone except for maybe Bencole. Yeah, I personally, I mean, you all know where I fall on a lot of this kind of thing. I think that working on something small scale winds up affecting big scale. So one just sort of leads to another naturally, and doing anything else is sort of forcing it. I suspect that she kind of feels that way as well, to be honest, from the way that she handles everything. But anyway, so, all right. this is an interesting section here where everybody is sort of deciding what they want to do with this house truck, because it brings a lot more, it brings with it potential to do a lot more in terms of trade and helping people because of its being as armored as it is. Like, this truck took gunfire in the tires and the walls and everything, and the little girls hiding inside were completely unhurt and the walls were unpunctured. It was, the outside of it was beat up, but they were able to survive and it was okay. And if they had all been paying more attention and hadn't been sort of like, they didn't have a lookout or anything when they were attacked, it turns out. They just assumed they'd be able to see someone coming, and they didn't. There was a huge, leftover chimney in the way. So if they had been able to see these guys coming and hide within the house truck, unless these dudes toppled it over and somehow got in from underneath, but I suspect that's also accounted for in the design of the van, these people would all have been safe locked up inside there. And so this is a pretty huge boon that they have gotten this, and it's opening the door to more contact with more people, which understandably is leading everybody in different directions in terms of expectation, worry, and sometimes just outright paranoia. And I hesitate to even use the word paranoia because I feel like that sounds so dismissive of their concerns, which are completely valid, I would like to say. But I do feel like there is something to be said, and I think it's Larkin who says it was just, everybody acknowledges that, quote, God is change, but when it comes right down to it, none of us really want change. And that's what we're kind of up against, is like dealing with the fact that we are interested in making the world better, in making Acorn bigger and more self-reliant, in being able to do certain things in the world that expand and create a solid foundation on which we can rebuild and have a community like the ones that we used to have, or at least better than what we have now most of the time. And yet, none of us wants to actually take the steps we need to make that happen, because those steps involve big changes and a ton of risk. This is the eternal struggle, isn't it? How to change things in your life and be better and do better, but not have those things sort of take over the worry of them, take over your life and cause you to become basically impotent. Because I feel like that's a real thing that happens to us, is that we become stymied by all of the potential and the choices in front of us that we don't do anything. It's a risk, and I really have struggled with that myself in life. I have always been a bit more of a risk taker than most people, but I'm not going to lie and say that I haven't done things more cautiously that I look at now and I'm sort of wishing I had handled differently, because I was just too afraid. That's just, human nature. And these people, the stakes are so much higher than it is for the average person. Like, most of us, when we're like, oh, should I move across the country and change my job? Or will that job turn out to be a bad fit? Will I be able to find someplace decent to live? Will I be able to afford to live there comfortably? All of these things are very valid things to be worried about. But what our folks in this story are worried about are, am I going to be murdered? Am I going to be raped? Am I going to be killed, tortured, lit on fire? Will the entire community be brought down around my ears? Will we lose everything? Will somebody follow us back, take the house truck, take our crops? like the stakes are so high that it's really, really understandable why everybody is sort of like sitting on their hands. You know, I don't blame them. I really, really don't. So we get some information here about Alaska and the fact that they have seceded from the United States. This is the kind of thing that, you know, maybe when this was written might have seemed a little bit more outlandish, but nowadays I feel like secession of some states might actually be better for the U.S. in general. And I live in Texas, and I have to say, if Texas seceded, I think that would be better for the U.S. because this state is so backward in so many ways. And I would just figure out a way to get the hell out of Texas and move somewhere else. So I don't think secession is always a bad thing. And the way that Alaska has decided to handle it, it feels pretty... It might be a smart move for them because they're basically being flooded with all these refugees from all over the rest of the country. And Alaska's plenty big, but it's not like they're flush with tons of resources to begin with. And everybody is heading up there looking for this like promised land. And of course, it's not going to be that, you know, people who are predatory and taking advantage in the southern areas of the country are going to figure out where all of the bodies are and follow those folks up and be predatory up there eventually as well, even if they're not there yet. So we have this summary of what happened with Dan and the attack and all of that, which I feel like we pretty much knew, so I'm not going to get into that. No, we didn't know the details of it, but she was able to put a lot of this together, and really what this is more of like a dramatic retelling. And they have this funeral and they plant the ashes and seeds or seedlings of oak trees as part of their ceremony. And meanwhile, he's really worried about his two sisters that were taken and he wants to go and find them. And he's feeling very cautious about this community that he has unexpectedly become a part of. You know, like they were all fucking conked out when these people arrived and basically saved them. And he doesn't know anything about them. So we have the funeral service, and there's actually like a couple of pretty moving poems. We give our dead to the orchards and the groves. We give our dead to life. Death is a great change, is life's greatest change. We honor our beloved dead as we mix their essence with the earth. We remember them, and within us they live. And I really liked that. I thought that was really beautiful and super simple, but, you know, all the more powerful because of that. So we get some discussion of the rising temperatures and the changing climate as well here in the next chapter. And people just sort of like adapting to that, you know, in the more arid regions, it's bad news. But in terms of up north in the area of California that they're living now, a lot of them are kind of glad because it feels almost like home in a way. There's something very familiar about it. And it allows them to grow things that they might not have been able to grow before. So there is some good coming from this. And she's talking about how a lot of like the young redwood trees that are under 100 years old are withering and people can't seem to understand why. And then we get some commentary again from Larkin. My father, perhaps because of his age, seems to have been a loving pessimist. He saw little good in our future. According to his writing, our greatness as a country, perhaps even the greatness of the human species, was in the past. My mother, on the other hand, was a somewhat reluctant optimist. Greatness for her, for Earthseed, for humanity, always seemed to run just ahead of her. Only she saw it, but that was enough to entice her on, seducing her as she seduced others. She worked hard at seducing people. She did it first by adopting vulnerable, needy people, then finding ways to make those people want to be a part of Earthseed. No matter how ridiculous Earthseed must have seemed with its starry destiny, it offered immediate rewards. Here was real community. Here was at least a semblance of security. Here was the comfort of ritual and routine and the emotional satisfaction of belonging to a team that stood together to meet challenges when challenges came. And for families, here was a place to raise children, to teach them basic skills that they might not learn elsewhere, and to keep them as safe as possible from the harsh, ugly lessons of the world outside. If Mother had created only Acorn, the refuge for the homeless and the orphaned, if she had created Acorn but not Earthseed, then I think she would have been a wholly admirable person. That is a fucking heavy thing to say. Basically, like, if she had just helped people, and there wasn't this ulterior motive of her wanting them to do what she said and believe what she said, this would have been fine. Which, you know, like, on the one hand, I feel like I kind of get that she feels like there is an inherent selfishness to the fact that this woman is collecting broken, desperate people in order to create a sort of religious community. On the other hand, though, if you genuinely believe that what you believe and teach is going to help people be able to function better in the world, then I don't know that it's just selfishness. It's certainly ego, because it's you having the arrogance to think that you can teach people how to better cope with problems. And that, you know, there's just that you have to have a certain amount of self-assurance with that many of us don't. At the same time, if you really believe that this can give somebody peace of mind, and you want them to experience that peace, there is a selflessness there. And I've always struggled with this in terms of people who are very religious and really devout and firm in their beliefs, who try and convert other people. Because in my father's case, for example, he believed so completely that me not converting, I think, was a permanent failure in his eyes. Like, that was something that he would not recover from, that he felt so strongly that becoming a born-again Christian was the way of salvation for my soul. And the fact that he could not convince me of that and could not get me to follow that path was him watching me ruin eternity for myself. Like, it's something that's so hard for me to understand, because I don't have that kind of belief in the afterlife at all. Not even like a flicker. Like, I think there's something when we die, but I don't believe in that kind of, like, you know, organized, almost a bureaucratic sort of system. And so for me, all I could think was, you just want me to believe what you believe. And of course, to a degree, yes, that's all it is. But there's also a genuine, like, desire to help somebody that you think needs it. And when you don't really believe in something, it's very difficult to see it from that perspective, I think. It's, you know, it's just a really tempting, it's a tempting idea to just be like, that person is just a control freak. Sure, there's elements of that. Absolutely. But if they believe something enough, I think there's also a desperation of this, like, you are so close to getting it, and if you just got it, everything would be clear to you, and you would be so much happier, and your life would feel better to you, and don't you want that? And I'm trying to give it to you, and why don't you want that? And I try very hard to keep that sort of thing in mind when I get angry at people who are attempting to convert me, which I still experience. And there's, you know, something about that a lot of people don't understand in terms of coming out to your family who does believe and who raised you to believe, and finally telling them you don't. And a lot of people are just like, just tell them they need to know that you're not part of this anymore. But the kind of disappointment that somebody who really believes is going to experience when they realize that you don't is a very personal disappointment that feels like they think they failed you. and they are going to beat themselves up as a result of your choice. And that's the part that I think a lot of us have a hard time with really like making peace with, is seeing our family that they still think they tried their best to do what was right, and now they have to live with the fact that they have failed you somehow, and them blaming themselves for that. It's a very like weighted and in some ways just kind of like guilt-riddled topic. So anyway, I understand where Larkin's coming from in this feeling, but I think she is being a little bit unfair and not as empathetic as she could be, which is interesting considering her mother's sharing, and I don't know if she has it, but it doesn't seem like that. Let's see. I'm trying to find the next spot because there's the welcoming of the baby. This woman had gotten raped and didn't know if she wanted to keep the baby when she found out she was pregnant. But when she gave birth, the baby looked so much like her little brother that had died that she loved him immediately and decided she did want to keep him and didn't want to give him up. And they have this whole like welcoming ceremony at Acorn to make him a part of the community. And this is when they all discuss what they want to do about this house truck and whether or not they want to take the risk of going out into the world. And they vote to do it, to take the risk. There are definitely people who are vehemently against. Bankole is one of them. And there's an interesting quote here that I highlighted. And again, this is from Lauren's perspective. I don't know how to do it. That scares me to death sometimes, always feeling driven to do something I don't know how to do. But I'm learning as I go along, and I've learned that I have to be careful how I talk about all of this, even to Acorn. Bankole isn't the only one of us who doesn't see the possibility of doing anything he hasn't seen done by others. And although Bankole would never say this, I suspect that somewhere inside himself he believes that large, important things are done only by powerful people in high positions far away from here. Therefore, what we do is, by definition, small and unimportant. This is odd, because in other ways Bankole has a healthy ego. He didn't let self-doubt or the doubts of his family or the laughter of his friends stop him from going to college and then medical school, surviving by way of a combination of scholarships, jobs, and huge debts. He began as a quietly arrogant black boy of no particular distinction, and he ended as a physician. But in a way, I suppose that's normal. I mean, it had been done before. Bankole himself had been taken to a black woman pediatrician when he was a child. What I'm trying to do isn't quite normal. It's been done. New belief systems have been introduced, but there's no standard way of introducing them, no way that can be depended on to work. What I'm trying to do is, I'm afraid, a crazy, difficult, dangerous undertaking. Best to talk about it only a little bit at a time. So I really like that, because the idea that like important things are only done by certain groups of people is something that I desperately cling to and have been trying to push myself to get over in the past few years, because it's so limiting and it's so it really abdicates responsibility. I feel like there's a portion of that makes you feel safe because you're not one of those people, so you don't need to worry about making those big choices. And the truth is, yes, you do. You just maybe aren't going to acknowledge how big the choices are, but they're still super important. And maybe you need to, like, you know, get some backbone and address that. But I like, because Bankole is more of an establishment man. He's older. He's a bit set in his ways. He experienced the world for a lot longer than everyone else, when it was still like being run with some sort of order and systems in place that could be depended on more than they are now. And because of that, it's understandable that authority figures and a system of approved methods would be really important to him, and it would feel more real than other things. So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting little character bit. So Dan comes and talks to Lauren, and this, I really like this conversation, and this is going to kind of wrap up this section. Dan asks about what Earthseed is, and says he heard that he doesn't have to join if he doesn't want to. And Lauren says, you don't. If you want to stay, that's fine. And if you decide to join us with Earthseed at some point, we'll be glad to welcome you. And he says, well, if we stay, what do we have to do? And she's basically like, you just need to contribute. You know, you need to work in the fields or tend the animals or help build buildings or clean or something. But there's a lot to do, and we can always use hands to do it. And she asks about whether or not he has been to school. And she's like, you know, I know that public school is not really a thing anymore, but you do have 2 little sisters, and we have an informal system of education here that probably would benefit them a lot, and they can learn how to do all kinds of things, cooking and sewing and, you know, and animal husbandry and whatever. So she also mentions that he will get a share of the profit from the sale of the crops, which I think is a pretty cool system. It's like a co-op, right? If you do join Earthseed, you'll get a larger share of the profit and a vote. It isn't really religious, your service, I mean. You guys don't believe in God or anything. I turned to look at him. Dan, of course we do. He just stared at me in silent, obvious disbelief. We don't believe the way your parents did, perhaps, but we do believe. So they talk about change and what that means, and he says, well, what can you do with that kind of God who's so impersonal? And she's like, I mean, yeah, it's impersonal and a little uncomfortable because it's so unfamiliar, but it's the truth. And once you accept that it's the truth, it's a lot easier for you to wrap your head around the world and the way things go. And he says things will get back to normal someday. You should do this in the same, this is Bankole who's talking to her about publishing the book. You should do this in the same way we go on paying taxes. And she gets out the book and opens it and shows him, do not worship God, inexorable God. Inexorable God neither needs nor wants your worship. Instead, acknowledge and attend God, learn from God, with forethought and intelligence, imagination and industry, shape God. When you must, yield to God, adapt and endure, for you are Earthseed and God is change. That's what we believe and strive to do. And Dan, understandably, is like, I still don't really get it. And she's like, that's all right. Like, it's a lot. So if you want to learn about it, you will. And he asks about praying. And he's like, if there's not a God up there watching over everything, then maybe prayer doesn't do anything. And she's like, no, prayer is very important because it's basically you talking things out to yourself. And it can help clear your mind and give you a feeling of control over things and just be a comfort. And, you know, she says, you're the one your words reach and strengthen. You can think of it as praying to that part of God that's within you. And I really like that a lot. I feel like that's a really good approach. And he mentions Jarret here. But it ends with, I'm going to talk about Jarret a little bit later. Dan talks about, I should be looking for my sisters. And she interrupts, but he interrupts back. And he says, if they hadn't saved themselves, Cassie and Mercy, my little sisters, I guess we'd all be dead. And he sort of shoves his plate at this point, and it goes right off the edge of the table and breaks. And he starts crying. And Lauren has to take his hand and be like, we are already looking for them. We have asked about, given people a lot of information about what they look like and where to find us and what happened. And we are offering a cash reward for information. And if we have to buy them back from somebody, then that's what we'll do. You can help us look for them by going out with the house truck when we start to do like sales and different street markets and shops and stuff. You can go out and ask around. And he is shocked that they have already started to look for his sisters. Like, he doesn't realize that that's of course going to be part of their effort here. And when he asks why, she says, we have all lost people. When we can save a life, we do. We couldn't stand it any other way. And he starts shaking really violently, and she has to like gather him up in her arms, and he just kind of breaks and starts sobbing. And it's pretty emotional. It's a lot. But I totally get that. Like when you feel like you've lost everything, and suddenly here are people who are like invested for whatever reason in what happened to strangers, essentially, you have to wonder if they could possibly be telling the truth, if it's some sort of ploy, or is there something like, is there actually some good in the world, shockingly? So chapter 5, we talk about politics. I'm not going to go into this too much because frankly, it's a little bit too much like what we're going through now, and we don't need a lot more discussion of this situation. But it's the couple of things that I took away from this were really interesting. We have to make a special effort to get news from outside. Real news, not rumors and not the news bullets that purport to tell us all who we need to know in flashy pictures and quick, witty, verbal 1-2 punches. Well-made news discs, on the other hand, or good satellite news services cost more. Gray and Emery Mora and one or two others say news bullets are enough. But we best pay attention to what's going on, so we subscribe to a good phone news service, and now and then we buy detailed world news discs. Such a weird idea. Obviously, the internet that we know is not part of this world. But I am just so curious what these, is it basically like a DVD of the news, I guess, that you get delivered like Netflix used to deliver DVDs? And they find out that Alaska is starting to team up with Canada and Russia to sort of stick together because everybody's also rushing up to Canada. So it makes sense that they're all going to start to kind of close ranks a little bit here. The climate is still getting pretty bad. Warming has made tropical diseases like malaria and dengue normal parts of life in the warm, wet Gulf Coast. But people are beginning to adapt. There's less cholera, for instance, and less hepatitis. There are fewer of all the diseases that result from bad sanitation, spoiled food, or malnutrition. People boil the water they drink in cities where there's a problem, and in squatter settlements with their open sewers, ditches. There are more gardens, and old-fashioned skills in food preservation are being revived. So there's some positive stuff. Talking about all of the different countries that are fighting within the same country, or countries that are paired next to each other going at it. There was one nuclear exchange that sort of settled everybody for 3 months or so because they got so scared between Iran and Iraq, but that dissipated and eventually everybody started fighting again. And then we have this short story about a boy who was part of a rich family who decided to really do something wild and go out and seek adventure, and he got taken and used as a sex slave basically, and his family finds him, and all of a sudden they have this huge problem with slavery, even though a bunch of other, millions probably of other people have been taken as slaves. When it's a rich white boy, all of a sudden it's an issue that we need to really crack down on. And then there's the discovery of an organism on Mars that can eat through rock, but unfortunately they all seem to die when they're brought back to Earth for study. And it looks like this is the end of NASA anyway. So there's this amazing discovery that they're then going to have to immediately drop. And then there's the fact that this asshole won the election. Jarret won. I find that I'm even more worried about our bodies. Before the election, I told myself that people had more sense than to elect a man whose supporters burn people alive as witches and torch the churches and homes of people they don't like. And she shares with us a speech. And what's so interesting about Jarret, and I said this before with the comparison with him and Trump, is that Jarret is so much more principled and articulated. Even if he is a piece of shit with misogynistic, racist xenophobic principles. He has those principles. You know what he believes. With Trump, it's just a bunch of nothing. He believes whatever the last person he talked to told him. And that's what makes it so hard to get a bead on him. All we know for sure about Trump is that he is a complete and utter moron who is super gullible, has like about a second grade understanding of the world. And that in itself is very frightening in its way. But Jarret is the kind of frightening that's like really specifically directed. And I don't know what to think about what's going to happen with him. And the end of this chapter ends with Lauren realizing finally that she's pregnant and talking about how thrilled Bankole is, but also terrified Bankole is, which that is the right sentiment. I feel like if you're not terrified when you realize you're going to have a kid, maybe you're not really like appreciating the full depth of the responsibility in front of you. So, but yeah, there was a lot packed in this section and a lot of like reflection. There's a lot in these books that makes you stop and like really think about what you just read before you continue. So I'm really enjoying it, and I'm very, very curious about Larkin and finding out more about her specifically and how she came to be. So thank you all very much for listening. Thank you again to Danique for commissioning this. I hope that you all enjoyed it, and hopefully I will be seeing you again soon with a new episode. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.